The African American Legend series highlights the accomplishments of blacks in areas as varied as politics, sports, aviation, business, literature, education, and religion. We will explore how African Americans have succeeded in areas where they had been previously excluded because of segregation, racism, and lack of opportunity. I'm your host, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown, Jr., and with us today is Ted Shaw, Professor of Law at Columbia University. Welcome to African American Legends.
Thank you. It's always good to be with you.
Well, you've been here when you were the Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund.
That's
and
right.
You've been totally immersed in civil rights and the protection of rights of citizens. What today are the major civil rights issues facing African Americans and facing Americans generally?
Well, first, when we talk about African Americans, in spite of the election of Barack Obama to the presidency, there's still a wide range of issues that flow from the historic subjugation of African Americans that now have systemic effect. And so when we talk about, incarceration rates of black folks, we talk about educational underachievement and poor schools in black communities. We talk about underemployment, voting rights issues. In spite of this great victory, they still resound today. So the fact of the matter is that racial discrimination against African Americans has not disappeared from the American scene, although I think we need to revisit that landscape because the election of Barack Obama signals something. It is a change. It's something that most of us would say we never thought we'd see in our lifetime, but here it is, and we have to ask ourselves, what does this mean for where we are as a nation? Certainly it's a giant leap forward, and there are some excuses that aren't on the table anymore. We can't have black children say, I can't do this or that. It's possible, and Barack Obama and others like you have blazed that trail and have proved it.
Well, the one thing that I always point up when people tell me everything is equal, blacks have the same opportunities as whites, the average income of the African American family is 70% of the average income of American white families.
That's right.
So long as you have that gap, it's almost like the gender gap in wages for women. So long as you have that 85 to 100% gap in women's salary, 80 to 100% in the white families, that gap means that there is discrimination, there is lack of opportunity. And I always say, and we've talked about that many times, it isn't that African Americans didn't believe that they had the ability, they didn't have the opportunity to utilize their ability. And that is what the civil rights issue is, and that's one that's going to be facing the president-elect, and it keeps organizations like the Legal Defense Fund very, very busy.
Oh, that's right. The work is still there. But this is a great moment. Something has changed, and it doesn't mean that discrimination has left the American stage any more than if Hillary Clinton had been elected president. The problems of sexism against women would be completely resolved and solved. You asked also what the civil rights issues are more broadly than African Americans, and Latinos are the largest minority group in the country now, and if you look at their measures like African Americans, whether it's health and wealth and education, employment, there's still a great gap there. There's been violence recently against Latino immigrants, and most recently in New York, not long ago, an incident sadly involving African Americans who attacked a Latino who was walking with his brother, and they thought that he was gay, which brings us to the rights and the conditions of the lesbian and gay and transsexual community. Those issues are there. Whether we talk about disability rights, whether we talk about gender, whether we talk about the LGBT community, whether we talk about racial discrimination, religious discrimination against Arabs and Sikhs, Muslims, these issues are still here. and the country still struggles with its ideals. And even with Barack Obama in the White House, we're going to continue to have to pay attention to these issues.
As a law professor, former head of the Legal Defense Fund, what attracted you in your legal career to go into civil rights advocacy?
Well, you know, I grew up, I was a child in the late 50s and the early 60s, and I grew up with the civil rights movement as the defining event, I think, in my life. I grew up here in New York City. And
what part of New York City?
Well, first in Harlem and then the Bronx. So I'm a son of Harlem. I'm back in Harlem now, 6 blocks from where I started out, in Central Harlem. And I grew up in a public housing project in the Bronx also, and went to high school here in New York City. Went to Wesleyan University in Connecticut, back to New York for law school. And, you know, I always come back to New York and have lived most of my life here.
What single event or person influenced your direction to go into civil rights law?
That's really hard to answer. I had a memory for years of being on the east end of 125th Street, and I thought it was a dream. The dream went something like there were people in the street right at the entrance to the Triborough Bridge, and in my vision of what happened, they were laying down with newspapers on top of them, and the traffic had come right up to them, and they were blocking traffic. Years later, when I was researching a thesis when I was in college on the civil rights movement, I came across an article. It was in the Boston Public Library about a demonstration to tie up the Triborough Bridge. It was about the failure to hire black folk on 125th Street in the stores. And I must have been with my maternal grandmother, and I must have seen this. That was a memory I had in my head, and obviously they were laying on top of newspapers, and the newspapers weren't on top of them. But, you know, my paternal grandmother, who did domestic work, cleaning white folks' homes, I remember she got up and went to the March on Washington that day. Wanted to take me with her. I was raised by my stepmother mostly, and my mother died when I was very young. And she was afraid there was going to be violence, and so I didn't go. But I have had in my office now, in my home, a handbill from the march that my grandmother brought back. I have the pen from the march. And, you know, my grandparents in their way, my 2 grandmothers, in their quiet way, like many tens of thousands, if not more, common, ordinary black folk, weren't leaders, and many of them women. But they played their role in the civil rights movement. So I saw all that, and at one point I decided I wanted to be involved in this, and I thought law was the best way to do it. I knew and read about Thurgood Marshall and Brown versus Board of Education when I was very young. I remember watching the, you know, To Kill a Mockingbird with the fictional Atticus Finch, and, you know, I thought that, boy, that's the kind of person I want to be. So all of that was in my mind, and I was on my way.
In my own experience, I've worked with the Legal Defense Fund since I was a young professor at New York University, and I also was active with the NAACP when my father, Dr. Roscoe C. Brown Sr., was in Roosevelt's Black Cabinet. So I've been identified with this my entire life, and I've got my children identified, my grandchildren, and it's very interesting to see the parallels between many of us who are doing these kind of things, because when many people talk about the Obama revolution, the Brown Revolution started in 1619 when we first came here.
That's right.
It continued all through Nat Turner and Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington. So it's a cumulative thing. And African Americans probably understand this, those of us who are older. Some of the younger African Americans don't understand it. And one way, it's good that they don't have to understand it. And another way, it's delusionary because there are still many mountains to climb.
Well, let me say a word about that, because I I actually saw some of these articles recently about you know, the civil rights generation, we're in a post-civil rights generation, and this is the Joshua generation, they're calling it, and, you know, some people saying, well, it's time to leave behind all that baggage in the past. History is a continuum, you know. In this country, collectively, we claim all of our history that we perceive as good. So people talk about the Founding Fathers, Jamestown, we just collectively celebrated the 400th anniversary of Jamestown, but you got to tell the whole story. History doesn't speak in half a voice. You got to talk about 1619 and slavery in Jamestown. Most black people, with all due respect, were not in the streets marching with Martin Luther King Jr. And it's never the case that most people are engaged in activism. It's a relative few who engage in that. And I find people in every generation, a group of people in every generation who pick up the torch and carry it for their leg of the race. And so when people talk about this generational divide, yeah, every generation has its divides, but at the same time, I find extraordinary people in this young generation who see those connections, and many people don't. But I think most of us collectively understand what this moment means and how it relates to our African Americans, that is, history, but also our national history, because we're an inextricable part of that national history.
Well, one of the things that you dealt with the Legal Defense Fund was affirmative action programs. And many whites say we don't need them anymore, it's giving people an unfair advantage. And this has actually caused laws to be passed against affirmative action. Has the pressure to end affirmative action increased or decreased, or do you think the Obama situation will actually just wipe away the need to have affirmative action programs?
Well, I suspect that, I don't suspect, I know that there are going to be many people who say this proves that you don't need affirmative action anymore. But Barack Obama's election didn't take place in a colorblind vacuum. You know, race at the end of the day was a central issue in this election, either you know, on the table or subterranean issue. Now, clearly this means something. I keep saying that it means something, and something has changed. But we still, affirmative action simply means that you consciously do something about inequality that is unearned and undeserved. Does it still mean something to be born black in this country as compared to being born white? Yes. Does it mean what it meant 50 years ago? No. Does the election of Barack Obama to the presidency change what it means? Yes, I think it does. I think it means that, that any child can not only dream, but can accomplish even at the highest office in the land. Does it mean that the playing field now is completely even? No, but it's getting better. So I think we still need to be conscious about doing something about all this inequality. We have too many children, black and brown, and poor white children, who don't have access to quality education, and college is becoming unaffordable for all Americans. And so should we consciously address those issues? Yes. Should we pay attention to the fact there's this gap that exists between black folks and white folks by all these measures that we've talked about? Yes, we should. That's what affirmative action does.
But what about the fact that affirmative action might disadvantage somebody who already has something, and when you take the place of a person who has a certain score with someone that has a lower score and denies that person the opportunity? That's the argument that is often presented against it's like the argument about the foreclosures. You want to save people who had their mortgages foreclosed, but somebody who worked hard and didn't pay their mortgage and did not foreclose it. What's going to happen? Those are the kind of value, and those are value arguments, and you're a lawyer and you make value arguments all the time. How would you argue this one?
Well, you know, it's a longer argument, of course, than we have time for, but here's the bottom line. In this country, we tend to see things as zero-sum games very often. If black folks get ahead, it's at the expense of white folks. Yeah. If white folks get ahead, it's at the expense of black folks. Brown folks, Asian Americans, Latinos, Native Americans, we're all competing with one another for limited opportunities and resources. The reality in life is that there are limited opportunities. I think we have to talk about programs and agendas that grow opportunities, that move us away from zero-sum games. But as long as we're in a competitive environment, we also have to understand the realities of these environments. Testing isn't the beginning and the end of qualifications or admissions to colleges or universities. So, for example, when the University of Michigan case was in the Supreme Court, or headed there, and I was deeply involved in this case, one of the things I kept pointing out was that there were many white students with lower scores than the white students who were suing, who had been admitted to the University of Michigan. And what that demonstrated was that the reason that these students didn't get in, regardless of what they said, wasn't simply because of race. There was something else going on. Universities consider a whole range of factors holistically if they're properly constructing admissions programs. And so it's much more complex than people think or say. When we talk about the mortgage meltdown, and it's true whether we talk about education or any other sphere of life, if we don't do something about this mortgage meltdown, if we don't help out some of those who are in trouble, even if there were unwise decisions made, either on them or by them, we're all going to be affected by it. It's dragging down the entire economy. We have to do something about it. Is the world completely fair? No. Should we try to make it as fair as we can be and distribute the unfairness so that it isn't heaped upon one group more than another? I believe we should. And that's what we've been trying to do. Some people don't believe in that and they attack it.
Well, eventually these issues come before our highest court, the Supreme Court. And again, these are basically value decisions as much as legal decisions. The composition of the Supreme Court is determined by the values of the people who are there and the people who appoint them. We've had more conservative, some people say right-wing appointees with the new administration, the Obama, the Democrats. How do you think that's going to affect the Supreme Court, and how do you think that'll affect some of their decisions on some of these very issues?
Well, I have two points I want to make on this. One is that I don't have a problem with conservatives being on the Supreme Court
so long as they don't outnumber the liberals.
Well, what I would say is two things. One is that there's conservative and there's conservative. There are people who are instinctively and intellectually conservative, but they're open-minded. There are ideological conservatives who are closed-minded, who have an ideological agenda. I don't want the latter on the Supreme Court or any court. I want people who are open-minded. Now, the second thing I would say is that there should be a balance. So even if I say intellectual conservatives, I don't have a problem with them. But we ought to have people who come from different perspectives, people who are more liberal or progressive. It's that kind of exchange and that education of one another that makes a big difference, I think, in terms of the court and its deliberations. And so, look, I consider myself, I'm not, conservative about most things. Perhaps I am about some things. And these appellations, these titles, eventually I think they break down. But what we've had is an ideological attempt to stack the courts with the end game being to drive certain agendas into the ground, anti-civil rights agendas, anti-choice agendas for women, agendas that are pro-employer, but so imbalanced as to not give workers a chance. Those agendas are problematic. I think we have to strive for a better balance. And I think that this administration that's coming in, the Obama administration, will do that. The Supreme Court I don't know when there's going to be another vacancy. I mean, everybody speculates there'll be 2 in the next year or 2, and that may be right. There could be even be 3. But even with those changes, if they're the changes we anticipate, the court's probably going to remain closely divided, with Justice Kennedy being the deciding vote in most cases.
As an attorney preparing a case for the Supreme Court, a civil rights case, what strategies do you propose or conceive of to persuade one group or the other? That's a question I'm sure goes into law school, but you can tell me in a couple of minutes, well, how you do this. Do you go into a Ouija board or a box, or do you actually look at the characteristics of the various judges and try to persuade them?
Well, you know, for those of us who have been before the court, either arguing cases orally or in briefs, we know the court. We know the justices. We know their precedent. We know what they've said and written fairly well. And in preparing arguments, you know, you have to argue, you have to do 2 things. One, you have to argue to the entire court. But we also know realistically that there's some votes that are going to be harder to get than others. And in oral argument, for example, if you're in a civil rights case and you're arguing before Justice Scalia, you're unlikely to get his vote. Do you have to answer his questions? Yes. Do you want to get tied up with his questions so that they dominate the entire argument? No. And so you have to gently steer the argument back to where you need to be. And that's an art. You learn it. And it's part of the appellate argument.
Where did you learn it?
Well, look, I worked at the Legal Defense Fund, the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, for about 26 years, and was a civil rights litigator for about 30 years. And you know, the Legal Defense Fund at one time, and it still may be true, other than the Solicitor General's Office of the Justice Department, which represents the government in the Supreme Court, had argued more cases, had more cases in the Supreme Court than any other institution. I learned from lawyers like Jack Greenberg and Jim Nabrit and Julius Chambers and you know, Elaine Jones, people whose names really stand in the annals of civil rights litigation, but also just great lawyers in any field, and argued many cases, you know, in district courts and in courts of appeals, and eventually in the Supreme Court. I had that opportunity, and you know, you do this work. And it becomes part of what you do and who you are, and you know, it doesn't seem to be the mountain that it was when you were a law student. Now, it's just what you do.
What about getting some of the younger African-American lawyers and law students interested in civil rights? Because there are many more opportunities, corporate opportunities, government opportunities. It seems like a thin group of people who are going to civil rights. So what do you do to get more African-American law students interested in that?
Well, amazingly enough, African-American, Latino, Asian-American, European-American law students coming out of clerkships and law school, we don't have any dearth of lawyers who wanted to work at the Legal Defense Fund. You still get just fabulous people. Do you get the same number who were interested years ago? Perhaps not. The issue may not be as hot in many people's minds as it was at one time, but we still get fabulous people. We don't have to do a whole lot to do that, but you do see other opportunities. The other thing that's happening now is that these law students come out with so much debt that many of them just need to go to work for a law firm just to be able to handle that debt.
Well, that raises the question of, could some of them, or do some of them actually do volunteer civil rights legislation? Because I know many law firms have pro bono attorneys. For example, the CFE case on equalizing education was done by Simpson Satcher, which over $1 million worth of law work as pro bono. So I would assume some of those African-American lawyers in corporate settings would be doing some pro bono civil rights legislation.
Oh, well, yeah, they do civil rights litigation in these law firms pro bono, and the law firms really have become instrumental in doing public interest litigation. You know, I'm also of counsel to Fulbright and Jaworski, a great law firm, and there's a very healthy pro bono practice there. And part of the work that I'm doing at the firm is defense work. Well, it's defense work on behalf of colleges, universities, corporations that are interested in pursuing diversity, and they're being attacked for it. And so I can now go into a law firm and do civil rights work, maybe unfortunately, but do it as defense work. So fortunately for me.
What course do you like to teach most in law?
Yeah, well, I teach civil procedure, which is a basic first-year course, and it gets students oriented in thinking like lawyers, understanding the legal system, you know, our system of litigation.
Well, how could I take one of your courses?
Well, you know, you don't need to take any of my courses. I learned from you.
Okay, today on African American Legends, we've been talking with Ted Shaw, professor of law at Columbia University and former director counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. Thanks for being with us on African American Legends, and thanks for the lesson in law.
Thank you. My real answer is constitutional law, though. That's what I love teaching.
Okay.
And thank you for being with you.
Okay, great.